Hello and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. So, what's the deal with the perfection of God? What does perfect mean? Perfect means complete, lacking nothing. Basically as good as it is possible to be. So, why is God perfect? God is perfect because God is an uncaused being. There's nothing else besides God that is uncaused. Because of that, reality exists of God and anything God decides to make real. So there's nothing else. One thing God decides to make real is not something that God does not possess, because God can create it. So it's not something God doesn't have. In fact, God has it because God has the power to create it. So what is there that God doesn't possess as an uncaused being? Nothing. There's nothing else. So God cannot be incomplete because there's nothing else that God doesn't already have. There's nothing else. There's only one uncaused being, God. There isn't anything else that is real that is uncaused. And God cannot create something that's uncaused because an uncaused thing can't be created because created things are caused. So uncaused things cannot be created. So God cannot create an uncaused thing. So the only uncaused thing is God, and there's only one God. God can't create a second God, for instance, because that second God would be uncaused. God can't create an uncaused thing. Plus, if there were two gods, they could each undo each other's creations, and neither would be a supreme God. And therefore, that sort of system doesn't work. So there can only be one uncaused God. Because it takes a singular God to decide what to make real and what not to make real out of the infinite number of material possibilities. So God is complete because there is nothing else that's real that God could have but doesn't have. So God must be complete. He must be perfect. God lacks nothing because there's nothing else that he could lack. Very simple. Now, God has a mind. And what that means is that God decides what is made real and what is not made real in material reality. So that decision making is evidence of God's decision making, God's mind. However, God's mind is uncaused. It's not something made of material parts. God is not subject to time and matter and energy and space, because God created those things. You can't be subject to the things that you created. So God's decision making is done outside of time and space and matter, and that sort of decision making is mysterious. Um, Human beings can't understand that. Uh, Human beings are, material beings, and we live in time. So we understand decision making in terms of a thought process made over time. You learn things, you experience things, you do things differently based on your learning and experience through time. This sort of decision making or consciousness of a human being. God is not like that. God is uncaused. He's not subject to matter, space, time, energy. God doesn't think like we do because he's not subject to time and matter and energy. Um, God's thinking is his decision making is an uncaused state. It's mysterious. It is not something you can ask about. Well, how does that work? How does God's mind work? You can't ask that question because it's not made of matter and space-time. And that sort of question, how does it work, only applies to material things, not an uncaused thing like God's mind. Is it a mind? Sure, because it does decide what becomes real and what does not become real. But it's not. It's not akin to some sort of material mechanism for making decisions. Material mechanisms for making decisions, like computers, for instance, clockworks, that sort of stuff. That uses a very deterministic method based on notions of classical physics. So there's an ordered sequence of cause and effect that's deterministic. It means you know it's going to happen when you set it up. You know the eventual result because you know what the process is, and the process is not going to deviate. It's deterministic. God is not subject to determinism. God is not made of matter and energy, which is where determinism comes from. Likewise, if you want to, processes that are random, for instance, they're also materialistic processes. There's an element of determinism in them. And even if you want to go at the quantum level and you want to get to quantum behavior, there's a probabilistic nature to what happens at the quantum level. But it's still based on the fact that it's material. You're talking about a material reality. God is not like that. God is not material. So God doesn't make decisions like a computer does, or like reading off a script. God doesn't make decisions like that. It's a decision made in time. God doesn't make random decisions. Random decisions are also mechanistic. You get a random generator on a computer. It's the computer that's giving you the random number based on a deterministic model set up in the program and in the computer's hardware. Even quantum level effects of where you use probability distributions to determine what's likely to happen. Even those have materialistic causes. God doesn't decide things like that. And all those things are a result of the material world. So God is not subject to the material world. God created the material world, created time in the material world. Therefore, God does not use material decision-making processes like randomness or chaos or a computer program or a script or a probability distribution like you might see at the quantum level. That's not how God makes decisions. God's decision-making is guided by God's nature, which is good. His nature is good. It's guided. But his decision-making process is mysterious. That doesn't make it incomplete. His God is complete. but he decides nonetheless. But it's mysterious. So just because God is perfect and complete doesn't mean that God doesn't have a mind. God does decide. He just doesn't decide in a temporal sense. God's decision making isn't done in a temporal sense, in some sort of timely order. God's not subject to time and space. God's decision making isn't like that. It's mysterious. It's outside of time. And God isn't made of parts. There's no way to explain how God makes decisions. You can know that God makes decisions because the decision on what becomes real and what does not become real out of the infinite possibilities for material reality does get made. So you know God does have a mind. God does have decision-making abilities. But you also know, because God is timeless and the thing that creates material reality has to be outside of time, that decision-making process is not based on material decision-making processes like computer programs, randomness, chaos, scripts, even probability distributions. That's not how it's done. There is no way to explain how it is done. It's uncaused. There's nothing to look at and examine to determine how God makes up his mind. But God does make up his mind. Does that mean God isn't conscious like a human being or, a sentient being? No, God is definitely a sentient being. Just not like a human is. God is not subject to time like a human. We're both sentient beings. But God's decision-making, his consciousness, is not like ours. It's mysterious. It's uncaused. It is not like ours. It's a mistake to claim that God has to think like human beings do. That's simply wrong. It's wrong. But that doesn't mean that God isn't conscious or doesn't have a mind or is imperfect. No, God is perfect and still has a mind. It's just a mystery. It's an uncaused mystery. It's a mystery you can't solve. There's nothing you can examine or study that could explain this. It's uncaused. Uncaused things are unexplainable. They simply are. They don't have causes. If you want to explain something, you got to refer to the causes of the thing. God doesn't have a cause. There's no way to explain God. All you can do is say, God exists. God is real. God is the case. That's all you can say. If you look at the what I call the dichotomy of existence, there are two things that could be uncaused. There's absolute nothingness and there's everythingness, both uncaused. Now, this is a dichotomy because these are two mutually exclusive things. So You can't have everythingness and absolute nothingness. And you can't have absolute nothingness and everythingness. They're mutually exclusive. It's either one or the other. They also exhaust all possibilities for existence. You're either this or you're in this. That's it. There's nowhere else to go. So when you're dealing with the dichotomy like this between two uncaused states for existence, it's got to be one or the other. And the reason it's one or the other is there is no reason why it's one or the other. It simply is the case that it must be one or the other. And it happens to be this. This is the case. It's not absolute nothingness because we're here. And if it was absolute nothingness, we wouldn't be here. So we know it's not this. So it's got to be this. Now, absolute nothingness is the most extreme form of nothingness that's conceivable. Absolute nothingness means there is nothing, there never was anything, and there will never be anything. There's no time, there's no outer space, there's no God. There is nothing. Not even some sort of realm which you could say is nothingness. No, there simply is absolute nothingness, the most extreme form of nothingness conceivable. This does not have a cause. I mean, what could cause this? There's nothing that could cause this. If this were true, it would simply be the case. But thank God it's not. This is the case instead. See, absolute nothingness can't have a cause. There's nothing that can cause absolute nothingness. And the reason is because if there was something that could cause absolute nothingness, then that thing itself would also have to have a cause. And so on and so on and so on and so on. Until you reach something uncaused. But if there was an uncaused thing, then that uncaused thing could never cease to exist, and therefore absolute nothingness could never arise, because that uncaused thing would always be there, regardless. So you can't cause absolute nothingness, because anything that could cause it, you could never eliminate its eventual uncaused source, and therefore absolute nothingness, which wouldn't have that uncaused source, couldn't exist. It couldn't be the case. So you can't cause absolute nothingness. It would simply have to be the case. It would have to be the case. And that's it. No further explanation. And an uncaused thing cannot cease to exist because there is no cause that can cause it to exist to begin with, because it's uncaused. Therefore, there is no cause that can make it cease existing. If you can destroy something, then you can cause that thing. You can't destroy an uncaused thing. So you can't create an uncaused thing either. An uncaused thing simply is, and it can't cease to be. It's eternal. It will always be. There's no way to get rid of it. It simply is, and it will always be. Like God. God described himself as, I am who am. Yahweh, I am who am. And what God is saying is, I am uncaused. I am who am. I am here. There was never a time I wasn't here. There will never be a time when I won't be here. I simply am uncaused. I am here. You can't get rid of me. Sorry, I'm uncaused. I can get rid of you, but you can't get rid of me. So you can't get, there's nothing that could create absolute nothingness. It's uncaused. There's nothing that could destroy absolute nothingness because it's uncaused. So we know it's not the case because we're here. So absolute nothingness can't cause us, so it can't possibly exist. It can't be real because we wouldn't be here if this was real. And this can't be a state that something creates. It's not like there could have been something and then absolute nothingness. No, because absolute nothingness is uncaused. It can't be created. There's no way to do it. So the very fact that we exist proves that this is not the case and will never be the case and can never be the case. So this part of the dichotomy is purely theoretical and metaphysical and not real at all and will never be real. It can't ever be real. But it is a possibility of an uncaused state, nonetheless. It's a theoretical possibility, but it will never be the case. So that leaves everythingness. So in everythingness, the thing with everythingness is everythingness also includes the possibility of somethingness. So everythingness includes everything that is logically possible. But that also includes that reality would be less than everything that is logically possible out of the infinite possibilities for material reality. It can also include somethingness. But the problem with everythingness is you need something to decide what becomes real and what does not. That's God. So God is essential for everythingness to even be the case. Because something, God, has to decide what becomes real and what does not become real out of everything that is logically possible. So you have to have a God. And this God has to be uncaused. God has to be uncaused because everything and somethingness is what is caused. So there has to be something that's uncaused that decides or causes somethingness to exist, or to decide what becomes real and what does not become real out of the infinite possibilities for material reality. Well, that decision maker has to be uncaused. It has, in fact, God is the only uncaused thing that is real. God has to be real. And God has the power to make decisions on what becomes real and what does not become real. But God is uncaused and outside of time and space, because creating material reality involves creating time and space and matter and energy and gravity and all those things that physicists love to talk about that are material. So God has to have this uncaused decision-making ability to decide what to make, if anything. But that decision-making ability is not a material decision-making process. It's not random or chaotic or scripted or deterministic. Like, in other words, we would know what God's going to do because God has to do it that way. No. Those are material ways of deciding things. God's not material. He's uncaused. He's mysterious. God's decision-making occurs. We know it because something exists. And we know God is guided by his nature because we know his nature is good. But there's nothing, you can't explain how an uncaused process works in a material sense because it's not material, it's uncaused. It doesn't have mechanisms and workings that you can examine and figure out how it works. It's simply mysterious. It's uncaused. It simply is the case. If you want to think about it, God's decision-making is similar in a sense to absolute nothingness. If you think about absolute nothingness, It's uncaused. There's no way to examine how it is that, absolute nothingness came to exist. Because it doesn't come to exist. It would simply be the case. It's simply a state of being. It has no cause, no why. It simply is. It would simply be the case. No way to explain that. You could simply know that it was the case. You could know it's the case, but you can't explain it. It's in a dichotomy. It's one or the other. There's no why, which is why it's one or the other. It simply is one or the other. It has no cause. These are uncaused states. There's no way to explain why they work. Just like absolute nothing. You can't explain why is there absolutely nothing. It would simply be. It would simply be the case, and that's it. And the same thing with God. God is simply the case, and that's it. God has decision-making abilities because everything has to have that. So God has to be uncaused, and has to be in charge of this, and has to have the ability to decide things. And that's just simply the case. It's a mystery. And it will always be a mystery. Period. It's an uncaused thing. It is simply the case. That does not mean God is incomplete. That does not mean God is not conscious. It's just an unconscious, an uncaused consciousness. That's what it is. It's not human consciousness. Human consciousness is caused. God's consciousness is uncaused. It is distinct from human consciousness. But consciousness nonetheless. Got to be careful trying to make, strict comparisons between God's mind and the human mind. Human mind is caused. It's subject to space and time. God's mind is uncaused, not subject to space and time. It is just like absolute nothingness is perfectly simple. Absolute nothingness is perfectly simple. There's nothing more to add to absolute nothing. And it's simple. Likewise, God is perfectly simple. God simply is the case. It's an uncaused being. Perfectly simple, uncaused being. Perfectly simple. Perfectly simple. To uncaused things. In fact, these are the only uncaused things that are possible, that you could possibly conceive of, would be absolute nothingness and God. And it just so happens to be the case that it's God that's real. Both perfectly simple. Simple in the sense that God doesn't have parts. You can't examine God to figure out how he decides things. There's no way to comprehend how he decides things. God doesn't use a process like a material thing would use a process to decide things. God is perfectly simple, just like absolute nothingness would be perfectly simple uncaused state. Simply is. God, perfectly simple uncaused state, simply is, but has decision-making ability nonetheless, because he must, in order for everythingness to be the case on this side of the dichotomy of existence. So, God is a mystery, but you have to remember that God is uncaused, and what that means. And so, Arguments about, well, God can't be perfect if he has a consciousness. That's simply wrong. God is perfect because there's nothing else that God lacks. God has a consciousness. Why? Because God decides things. And on this side of the dichotomy, things have to be decided. Something has to decide what becomes real and what does not. And that thing has to be uncaused. But it has to have that ability to decide and the power to create things. So God does have a consciousness. The ability to decide things is a hallmark of consciousness. It's just not human consciousness, but real nonetheless. So just because God doesn't think like human beings in the sense of the processes, the material processes we use to think, doesn't mean God doesn't have a consciousness or a mind. God's consciousness and mind is unique. It's distinct. It's mysterious. So any argument that claims, God can't have a mind because his mind couldn't possibly work like a human mind, which requires an element of imperfection or incompleteness. That argument doesn't make sense because it's equating God's consciousness with human consciousness. But they're distinct. They're two different things. They're like apples and oranges. You can't say the two are equal. God is unique. This is a special circumstance, a unique circumstance of consciousness, unlike human consciousness. So those arguments fail because they're trying to make you think God to think like a human being. That's just not the case. Not true at all. God's a special case. Special case. Uncaused being. Humans, caused beings, subject to time. God, not subject to time. Uncaused being. Very different! Okay, so end result, God is perfect, but God also has a mind. God's a special case of an uncaused being who is perfectly simple. Is that comprehensible? No. Can a human being fully understand that? No. You can't. It's a mystery. Because it's real, and it just simply happens to be the case. There's no whys about it. You can't ask why or how. It simply is the case. But God is distinct in that sense from human beings. But God does have a mind and is a sentient being, nonetheless. All right. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Maybe I'll address them in a future video or in the comments below. And please press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. Take care.